Section 8 of a Traveller's Narrative written to illustrate the episode of the Bab. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicholas James Bridgewater. A Traveller's Narrative written to illustrate the episode of the Bab by Abdul-Baha Abbas. Translated by Edward Granville Browne. Section 8. Let us return, however, to our original subject. Of the Bab's writings, many remained in men's hands. Some of these were commentaries on, and interpretations of, the verses of the Qur'an. Some were prayers, homilies, and hints of the true significance of certain passages. Others were exhortations, admonitions, dissertations on the different branches of the doctrine of the divine unity, demonstrations of the special prophetic mission of the Lord of existing things, Muhammad, and, as it hath been understood, encouragements to amendment of character, severance from worldly states, and dependence on the inspirations of God. But the essence and purport of his compositions were the praises and descriptions of that reality soon to appear, which was his only object and aim, his darling and his desire. For he regarded his own appearance as that of a harbinger of good tidings, and considered his own real nature merely as a means for the manifestation of the greater perfections of that One. And indeed he ceased not from celebrating him by night or day for a single instant, but used to signify to all his followers that they should expect his arising, in such wise that he declares in his writings, I am a letter out of that most mighty book, and a dewdrop from that limitless ocean, and, when he shall appear, my true nature, my mysteries, riddles, and intimations will become evident, and the embryo of this religion shall develop through the grades of its being and ascent, attain to the station of the most comely of forms, and become adorned with the robe of Blessed be God, the best of creators. And this event will disclose itself in the year A.H. 1269, which corresponds to the number of the year of after a while, and thou shalt see the mountains which thou thinkest so solid passing away like the passing of the clouds shall be fulfilled. In short, he so described him that, in his own expression, he regarded approach to the divine bounty and attainment of the highest degrees of perfection in the worlds of humanity as dependent on love for him, and so inflamed was he with his flame that commemoration of him was the bright candle of his dark nights in the fortress of Maku, and remembrance of him was the best of companions in the straits of the prison of Chehriq. Thereby he obtained spiritual enlargements, with his wine was he inebriated, and at remembrance of him did he rejoice. All of his followers, too, were in expectation of the appearance of these signs, and each one of his intimates was seeking after the fulfillment of these forecasts. Now, from the beginning of the manifestation of the Bab, there was in Tehran, which the Bab called the Holy Land, a youth of the family of one of the ministers, and of noble lineage, gifted in every way, and adorned with purity and nobility. Although he combined lofty lineage with high connection, and although his ancestors were men of note in Persia and universally sought after, yet he was not of a race of doctors or of a family of scholars. Now this youth was from his earliest adolescence celebrated amongst those of the ministerial class, both relatives and strangers, for single-mindedness, and was from childhood pointed out as remarkable for sagacity, and held in regard in the eyes of the wise. He did not, however, after the fashion of his ancestors, desire elevation to lofty ranks, nor seek advancement to splendid but transient positions. His extreme aptitude was nevertheless admitted by all, and his excessive acuteness and intelligence were universally avowed. In the eyes of the common folk he enjoyed a wonderful esteem, and in all gatherings and assemblies he had a marvellous speech and delivery. Notwithstanding lack of instruction and education, such was the keenness of his penetration and the readiness of his apprehension, that when, during his youthful prime, he appeared in assemblies where questions of divinity and points of metaphysic were being discussed, and in presence of a great concourse of doctors and scholars, loosed his tongue, all those present were amazed, accounting this as a sort of prodigy beyond the discernment natural to the human race. From his early years he was the hope of his kindred, and the unique one of his family and race, nay, their refuge and shelter. However, in spite of these conditions and circumstances, as he wore a kolah on his head, note: the Persian lambskin hat worn by government employees and civilians. The words mukallah, hatted, and mu'ammam, turbaned, are commonly used to distinguish the laity or civilian class from the clergy or learned class. The latter usually shave the head, while the former wear their head in zolf, descending below the level of the ears. And locks flowing over his shoulder, no one imagined that he would become the source of such matters, or that the waves of his flood would reach the zenith of this firmament. When the question of the Bab was noised abroad, signs of partiality appeared in him. At the first he apprised his relatives and connections, and the children and dependents of his own circle. Subsequently he occupied his energies by day and night in inviting friends and strangers to embrace the new faith. He arose with mighty resolution, engaged with the utmost constancy in systematizing the principles and consolidating the ethical canons of that society in every way, and strove by all means to protect and guard these people. When he had thus established the foundations in Tehran, he hastened to Mazandaran, where he displayed in assemblies, meetings, conferences, inns, mosques, and colleges a mighty power of utterance and exposition. Whoever beheld his open brow, or heard his vivid eulogies, perceived him with the eye of actual vision to be a patent demonstration, a latent magnetic force, and a pervading influence. A great number both of rich and poor, and of erudite doctors, were attracted by his preaching, and washed their heads of heart and life, being so enkindled that they laid down their lives under the sword, dancing with joy. Thus, amongst many instances, one day 4 learned and accomplished scholars of the divines of Nur were presented in his company, and in such wise did he expound that all 4 were involuntarily constrained to entreat him to accept them for his service, for by dint of his eloquence, which was like evident sorcery, he satisfied these eminent doctors that they were in reality children engaged in the rudiments of study and the merest tyros, and therefore they must read the alphabet from the beginning. Several protracted conferences were passed in expounding and elucidating the point and the aleph of the Absolute, wherein the doctors present were astounded and filled with amazement and astonishment at the seething and roaring of the ocean of his utterance. The report of this occurrence reached the hearing of far and near, and deep despondency fell on the adversaries. The regions of Nur were filled with excitement and commotion at these events, and the noise of this mischief and trouble smote the ears of the citizens of Barfurush. The chief divine of Nur, Mullah Muhammad, was in Qishlaq. When he heard of these occurrences, he sent 2 of the most distinguished and profound of the doctors, who were possessed of wondrous eloquence, effective oratorical talent, conclusiveness of argument, and brilliant powers of demonstration, to quench this fire, and to subdue and overcome this young man by force of argument, either reducing him to penitence or causing him to despair of the successful issue of his projects. Glory be to God for his wondrous decrees. When those 2 doctors entered the presence of that young man, saw the waves of his utterance, and heard the force of his arguments, they unfolded like the rose, and were stirred like the multitude, and, abandoning altar and chair, pulpit and preferment, wealth and luxury, and evening and morning congregations, they applied themselves to the furtherance of the objects of this person, even inviting the chief divine to tender his allegiance. So when this young man, with a faculty of speech like a rushing torrent, set out for Amul and Sauri, he met with that experienced doctor and that illustrious divine in Qishlaq of Nur, and the people assembled from all quarters awaiting the result. His accomplished reverence the divine, although he was of universally acknowledged excellence, and in science the most learned of his contemporaries, nevertheless decided to have recourse to augury as to whether he should engage in discussion and disputation. This did not prove favorable, and he therefore excused himself, deferring the discussion until some other time. His incompetency and shortcoming thereby became known and suspected, and this caused the adherence, confirmation, and edification of many. In brief outline, the narrative is this. For some while he wandered about in those districts. After the death of the late Prince Muhammad Shah, he returned to Tehran, having in his mind the intention of corresponding and entering into relations with the Bab. The medium of this correspondence was the celebrated Mullah Abdul Karim of Qazvin, who was the Bab's mainstay and trusted intimate. Now, since a great celebrity had been attained for Bahá'u'lláh in Tehran, and the hearts of men were disposed towards him, he, together with Mullah Abdul Karim, considered it as expedient that, in face of the agitation amongst the doctors, the aggressiveness of the greater part of the people of Persia, and the irresistible power of the Amir Nizam, whereby both the Bab and Baha'u'lláh were in great danger and liable to incur severe punishment, some measure should be adopted to direct the thoughts of men towards some absent person, by which means Baha'u'lláh would remain protected from the interference of all men. And since further, having regard to sundry considerations, they did not consider an outsider as suitable, they cast the lot of this augury to the name of Baha'u'llah's brother Mirza Yahya, by the assistance and instruction of Baha'u'lláh. Therefore they made him notorious and famous on the tongues of friends and foes, and wrote letters ostensibly at his dictation to the Bab. And since secret correspondences were in process, the Bab highly approved of this scheme. So Mirza Yahya was concealed and hidden, while mention of him was on the tongues and in the mouths of men. And this mighty plan was of wondrous efficacy, for Baha'u'lláh, though he was known and seen, remained safe and secure. And this veil was the cause that no one outside the sect fathomed the matter, or fell into the idea of molestation, until Baha'u'lláh quitted Tehran at the permission of the king, and was permitted to withdraw to the supreme shrines. End of section 8.